All right, let's dive deep today. We're tackling paternalism.
Ooh, interesting.
You know those times when someone tries to limit your freedom for your own good,
Right.
even if you disagree? We're going to untangle all of the ethics and the philosophy behind it all. And we're drawing from some seriously insightful stuff
Yeah.
from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Excellent source.
Think of it as paternalism explained to a philosopher,
I like it.
with all the juicy details
Right.
and all the thought-provoking arguments laid out.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, because paternalism really does like pop up everywhere,
Everywhere.
from everyday interactions to like major government policies.
Absolutely.
So grasping those core concepts is really going to help us understand those debates more deeply.
Exactly. It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
Paternalism is often about trying to help.
Yeah.
But where do we draw the line between looking out for someone and overstepping their autonomy?
Exactly. That's the big question.
That is the huge question. To start, let's nail down a clear definition.
Okay.
The Stanford Encyclopedia breaks it down into 3 key elements.
Right.
First, it involves interfering with someone's liberty or autonomy.
And that interference, it isn't always obvious.
Right.
It can be as direct as like a law prohibiting something,
Well,
or as subtle as a parent kind of manipulating their child's inheritance to steer them toward a certain career path.
wow, that inheritance example.
Yeah.
That is such a great illustration of how tricky this can get.
It is.
Because it might not feel like a direct violation of freedom,
Right.
but it is definitely shaping the person's choices in a major way.
For sure.
Which brings us to the second element of the definition.
Yeah.
This interference happens without the person's consent.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember that consent is more than just not objecting. It means like having a genuine understanding of the situation and like freely choosing to participate. Paternalism often involves situations where someone either doesn't know about the interference or isn't in a position to give, meaningful consent.
So it could be like a doctor withholding information about a serious diagnosis,
Right.
thinking it's best for the patient not to know.
Yeah.
Or it could even be those terms and conditions we all blindly agree to online.
Oh, yeah.
Are we truly consenting if we haven't read that 20-page document?
Those are such good examples. It really highlights how consent can be complex and even manipulated in ways that undermine genuine autonomy.
Yeah.
The final piece of the definition is the motivation behind the interference.
Okay.
It has to be about improving the person's welfare or protecting them from harm.
Okay, so it's not just about meddling. There has to be a perceived good intention behind the action. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. How do we determine if an action is truly motivated by paternalism? What if there are mixed motives involved?
Yeah, you've hit on a crucial point.
Okay.
We need to look at the primary justification for the action.
Okay.
So let's say the government decides to ban a certain recreational drug.
Right.
They might argue that it's to protect public health, but they could also have motives like reducing crime or even appeasing a particular voter base.
So even if there are other factors at play, if that core aim is to protect individuals from perceived harm,
Right.
even against their will, then it falls under the umbrella of paternalism.
Exactly. It's about dissecting the reasoning behind the action.
Right.
And identifying that driving force. Now, once we have that core definition down, we
Yeah.
can start exploring the different flavors of paternalism because it's not a one-size-fits-all concept.
I love you put it that way. Flavors of paternalism.
Yeah,
It's like there's a whole spectrum of ways this concept can manifest in the real world.
absolutely.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia lays out some really intriguing distinctions. One that jumps out is the classic hard versus soft paternalism debate.
Oh, that's a fundamental distinction.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine someone's about to walk across a damaged bridge.
Okay.
A soft paternalist would say it's okay to intervene temporarily just to, ensure that they know that the bridge is dangerous.
Okay.
But a hard paternalist might argue that that you're justified in preventing them from crossing, even if they're fully aware of the risk, because their safety trumps their right to make that choice.
That's a powerful example. It really clarifies the difference in approach.
Yeah,
Soft paternalism focuses on ensuring people have all the information
right.
and are making informed choices,
Yeah.
while hard paternalism allows for intervention even when choices are fully informed,
Right.
if the potential harm is deemed significant enough.
Precisely. And that damaged bridge scenario is a classic thought experiment because it forces us to grapple with that core tension of paternalism. When does concern for someone's well-being justify overriding their autonomy?
Yeah, it makes me think about all the times in our lives where we might encounter this dilemma, not with damaged bridges, but with like everyday decisions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
A parent trying to prevent their child from pursuing a risky career path,
Right.
or uh, or a friend hiding unhealthy snacks from a loved one struggling with their weight. It raises the question, are these acts of care
Yeah.
or are they crossing a line?
That's the beauty of philosophical inquiry. It
Yeah.
helps us examine those everyday situations with more clarity
More clarity.
and nuance. And understanding the distinction between hard and soft paternalism gives us a framework for evaluating those choices.
So hard and soft paternalism provide a framework for thinking about the degree of intervention.
Yes.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia also distinguishes between the scope of paternalism, right?
Right.
There's broad versus narrow paternalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Narrow paternalism focuses primarily on state coercion, those laws and regulations designed to protect people from harm, like seatbelt laws or bans on certain drugs. Broad paternalism casts a much wider net, encompassing any paternalistic action, whether by the government, institutions, or even individuals in personal relationships.
So narrow paternalism is about the government stepping in,
Yeah.
while broad paternalism could be like your doctor recommending a specific treatment plan,
Yes.
even if you have reservations,
Yeah.
or your friend hiding your cigarettes
Yeah.
because they think it's bad for you.
Exactly. It highlights how paternalism can be woven into the very fabric of our lives, influencing our choices on multiple levels, not just through official policies.
This is fascinating. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion,
Right.
revealing all these subtle ways that paternalism shapes our experiences.
Okay, so we've got hard versus soft, broad versus narrow. What other distinctions did the Stanford Encyclopedia highlight?
There's another crucial one, weak versus strong paternalism.
Okay.
This distinction focuses on the justification for intervention, particularly when it comes to potentially irrational choices. Okay, let's unpack that one. What exactly do they mean by irrational choices in this context?
It's about those times when someone's actions seem to contradict their own stated goals or values.
Okay.
So a weak paternalist would argue that it's okay to interfere when those actions are based on a misunderstanding of facts.
Okay.
For example, if someone jumps out of a window believing they can fly, a weak paternalist might be justified in restraining them.
Right,
Okay.
because their action stems from a factually incorrect belief.
Exactly.
They don't understand the law of gravity.
Exactly. They're acting against their own best interests.
Right.
But it's due to a mistaken understanding of reality. Now, a strong paternalist would go further and argue that intervention can be justified even when the person's actions are based on potentially irrational values.
So even if they understand the facts,
Right.
but their values or preferences seem
Yeah.
like off to the paternalist,
Yeah.
that's where things get really tricky.
Exactly. Imagine someone who refuses to wear a helmet while riding a motorcycle. Even though they acknowledge the safety risks, they might genuinely value feeling the wind in their hair over safety. But a strong paternalist might argue that that value judgment is irrational
Okay.
and therefore grounds for intervention.
That's a great example because it forces us to confront the question. Who gets to decide what constitutes a rational value
Yeah.
or preference?
Yeah.
Aren't those like subjective judgments based on individual experiences?
Like in priorities.
That's the heart of the debate. Strong paternalism raises concerns about imposing one's own values on others, even if it's done with good intentions. But it also compels us to think about the limits of tolerance. Are there any choices so irrational that we have a moral obligation to intervene,
Right.
even if it infringes on someone's autonomy? It's mind-blowing. It's like we're diving deeper and deeper into the philosophical rabbit hole, and each distinction raises more questions than answers. Okay, so we've covered hard versus soft, broad versus narrow, and weak versus strong. Is there anything else on the paternalism tasting menu?
There are two more key distinctions. First, pure versus impure paternalism.
Okay.
Pure paternalism is when the person being interfered with is the same person who's supposed to benefit.
Okay.
Think of mandatory seatbelt laws.
Right.
They're designed to protect the driver and passengers of that specific vehicle.
Okay, that makes sense. So impure paternalism is when someone else benefits from the interference?
Not quite. It's when the group being interfered with is larger than the group being protected.
Okay.
Take, for example, regulations on cigarette manufacturers.
Okay.
The goal is to protect consumers from the health risks of smoking. But the regulations also restrict the manufacturers even if they're not smokers themselves.
Ah, I see the distinction. It's about the scope of who's affected by the paternalistic action.
Yeah.
So even seemingly victimless actions like producing and selling a product
Yeah.
can have paternalistic implications for others
Right.
if those actions are deemed harmful to a specific group.
Precisely. It highlights the ripple effects of paternalism and how it can extend beyond the individual being directly targeted. The final distinction is moral versus welfare paternalism.
Okay.
Most justifications for paternalism, they revolve around a person's welfare, their physical and psychological well-being.
Right.
But moral paternalism introduces a whole other layer of complexity, right?
Okay.
It's about protecting someone's moral character, even if their choices aren't harming anyone else.
Right.
It's based on the idea that certain actions or behaviors are morally wrong, even if they don't directly impact someone's physical or psychological well-being. For instance, some argue against prostitution, not because it's inherently harmful to the prostitutes, but because they view it as morally degrading or exploitative.
That's a really sensitive area because who gets to define what is morally better?
Right.
And are we stepping on someone's autonomy by imposing our own moral judgments on their choices, especially when those choices aren't harming anyone else?
You've hit on the core ethical dilemma of moral paternalism.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront those thorny questions about the role of morality in a free society, whose values should prevail,
Yeah.
and where we draw the line between protecting moral standards and respecting individual liberty.
This is so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a single concept can have so many different dimensions. But before we get too lost in the ethical weeds, let's shift gears a bit and dive into the core debate. Is paternalism ever justified? And if so, when and why?
Excellent point. We've laid out the conceptual framework.
Right.
Now let's explore the ethical battleground. The Stanford Encyclopedia does a fantastic job of presenting both sides of the argument, and it gets really heated. Welcome back to our deep dive into paternalism. And remember where we left off, right on the precipice of the ethical battleground. This is where the philosophical heavyweights come out swinging.
It's a philosophical boxing match.
Yeah.
In one corner, we have the staunch anti-paternalists just fiercely defending individual autonomy.
Oh, yeah.
Thinkers like John Stuart Mill
Yeah.
and Immanuel Kant, who argued that even if it leads to mistakes,
Right.
people have the right to make their own choices
Yeah.
and learn from their experiences.
Exactly. They see any interference, even with good intentions, as a violation of individual liberty and a failure to respect people as like rational, self-determining beings.
Yeah.
For them, the only justifiable limitations on freedom are those necessary to prevent harm to others. Harm to oneself isn't enough.
Right. But then in the other corner, you have those who argue that sometimes preventing harm, even to oneself, outweighs absolute freedom.
Right.
But the classic example is seatbelt laws. Most people agree that it's justified for the government to mandate seatbelt use, even though it restricts individual choice.
Right.
Because the potential for saving lives from car accidents outweighs the minor inconvenience.
That's a great example of a consequentialist justification for paternalism.
Okay.
Consequentialism, in a nutshell, judges the morality of an action based on its outcomes.
Okay.
So if the overall consequences are good, even if it involves some infringement on autonomy, the action can be deemed morally permissible.
It makes me think about public health measures like vaccination requirements.
Yeah.
There's always a huge debate about individual freedom versus the collective good.
Right?
And a consequentialist would argue that protecting the community from a preventable disease outweighs the individual's right to refuse vaccination.
Exactly. And those debates often get very heated because they touch on like fundamental values about individual liberty and the role of the state. But it's not just about consequences. There are also arguments for paternalism based on the concept of autonomy itself.
Wait, so you're saying there are arguments for limiting autonomy in order to protect autonomy?
Yes.
That sounds almost paradoxical.
It does sound kind of counterintuitive, but hear me out.
Okay.
This perspective argues that sometimes we need to limit short-term autonomy to preserve or enhance long-term autonomy. Think about someone struggling with drug addiction.
Okay.
Their immediate choices might be driven by the addiction, but those choices ultimately undermine their capacity for rational decision-making in the long run.
So by intervening, perhaps through mandatory treatment,
Yeah.
we're actually helping them regain control over their lives and make more autonomous choices in the future,
Right.
even if it means restricting their freedom in the present.
Precisely. It's a complex argument, but it challenges us to think about autonomy not just as freedom of choice in the moment,
Right.
but as the capacity to live a self-directed life over time.
That's a really nuanced perspective, and it definitely complicates the whole debate. So we've got the anti-paternalists championing individual freedom, the consequentialists weighing benefits against harms,
Mm-hmm.
and the autonomy-based paternalists arguing for, like, a more layered view of freedom.
Yeah.
Are there any other perspectives in this philosophical brawl?
There's another intriguing approach called the contractualist view.
Okay.
It asks a fascinating question. If we were fully informed and rational, what kind of paternalistic measures would we consent to? It's like imagining a hypothetical social contract where we agree to certain limits on our freedom in exchange for greater safety, well-being, or even the preservation of our long-term autonomy.
Okay, so it's like asking, what rules would we agree to if we were all perfectly rational and we could foresee the consequences of our choices?
Exactly.
I love that idea. It forces us to think beyond our immediate desires and consider what kind of society we want to live in,
Yeah.
even if it means accepting certain limitations on individual freedom.
Exactly. And of course, different people might reasonably agree to different levels of intervention. Some might draw a hard line against any interference, even if it's for their own good,
Right.
while others might be more willing to accept certain nudges or restrictions if it means promoting a safer or healthier society.
It seems like finding that sweet spot between individual freedom and collective well-being is the eternal challenge.
It is.
But speaking of nudges, that brings us to a fascinating modern twist on paternalism.
Yes.
Libertarian paternalism.
Ah, yes. This approach has gained a lot of traction in recent years.
It has.
It's all about using behavioral science and subtle nudges to influence choices
Okay.
without removing options or imposing penalties.
Okay, break it down for us. What exactly are these nudges and how do they work? Are we talking subliminal messages and mind control?
Not quite.
Okay.
Nudges are more about strategically designing environments
Okay.
to encourage certain choices.
Okay.
Think about the layout of a cafeteria.
Okay.
If healthy foods are placed at eye level and sugary drinks are tucked away in a less visible spot, people are more likely to choose the healthier options,
Right.
even though they still have the freedom to grab that soda if they want.
Or those opt-out retirement plans.
Yeah.
Where you're automatically enrolled unless you actively choose to opt out.
Yes.
It leverages our tendency towards inertia, our
Yeah.
preference for sticking with the default option
Yeah,
to encourage saving for retirement.
exactly. And it's been shown to be quite effective in promoting certain behaviors, from increasing organ donation rates to encouraging healthier eating habits.
It sounds almost too good to be true. But I imagine there are ethical concerns about this approach as well.
There are definitely concerns.
Right.
Critics of libertarian paternalism argue that even if it doesn't involve outright coercion, it can still be manipulative and undermine genuine autonomy.
Because even though there's no direct force, we're still being influenced in ways that we might not be fully aware of. It raises questions about transparency and
Yes,
consent.
precisely. The Stanford Encyclopedia dives into these ethical concerns, highlighting the importance of transparency in any nudging strategy.
Right.
Are people aware that a nudge is in place? Do they understand why it's being used? And are they truly free to resist it without facing negative consequences?
It makes me think about those dark patterns used in website design.
Oh, yeah.
There are subtle design choices that manipulate users into taking certain actions, like signing up for a subscription they didn't intend to,
Right.
or sharing more personal data than they're comfortable with.
That's a perfect example of how nudging techniques can be used in ethically questionable ways. It highlights the need for careful consideration and ethical guidelines when implementing nudges.
So it's not just about the technique itself, but
Yep.
how it's applied and whether it respects individual autonomy and transparency.
Exactly. And that brings us to another criticism of libertarian paternalism,
Okay.
the concern that it exploits our irrationality.
Okay, let's unpack that one. How are nudges exploiting our irrationality?
Well, many nudges work because they capitalize on our cognitive biases.
Okay.
Those quirks in our thinking that often lead us to make decisions that aren't in our best interests.
Right.
Think about those opt-out retirement plans again.
Right.
They're effective because of our status quo bias, our tendency to stick with the default option, even if it's not the most rational choice.
So we're essentially being nudged because of our flawed thinking,
Yeah.
not because we've made a reasoned, informed decision.
And that raises the question, is it ethical to use our own cognitive biases against us, even if it's for our own good?
It's a tough one. On the one hand, if it leads to positive outcomes, like saving for retirement or making healthier food choices, maybe it's a justifiable means to an end.
Right.
But on the other hand, it feels a bit like sneaky and manipulative, like we're being tricked into doing things we wouldn't otherwise choose if we were thinking more rationally.
That's the crux of the debate.
Yep.
Critics argue that exploiting our irrationality, even with good intentions, undermines our capacity for rational thought and decision-making in the long run. It's like treating people as children incapable of making their own choices, rather than empowering them to develop their rational faculties.
It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Are we really helping people by nudging them towards better choices
Right.
if they're not developing the skills and knowledge to make those choices for themselves?
That's a great analogy. It highlights the concern that libertarian paternalism, while potentially effective in the short term, might ultimately hinder the development of individual autonomy and rational decision-making.
So much to consider.
So much.
And we're just scratching the surface of the ethical debates surrounding nudging and paternalism.
It's a rich and complex topic with implications for how we design policies, interact with each other, and even understand our own decision-making processes. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into paternalism.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
Exploring all the different types, the ethical clashes, even that modern twist with libertarian paternalism and all those sneaky nudges.
Yes, as nudges.
But there's one big question that keeps swirling around in my mind.
Okay.
And it's right at the heart of this whole concept of paternalism.
Yeah.
What exactly do we mean by welfare when we talk about acting for someone's own good?
That's a brilliant question, and it's one that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries, literally.
Yeah.
Because the definition of welfare, it shapes the entire landscape of paternalism.
It really does.
It determines what we consider good for someone, and therefore what we might be justified in interfering with, even against their will.
Exactly. Is it purely about physical health and safety, like preventing someone from walking across that damaged bridge?
Right.
Or does it encompass a broader notion of well-being, including mental and emotional health, happiness, meaning, purpose, maybe even moral character?
You've hit on the key points of contention.
Okay.
The Stanford Encyclopedia lays out several different perspectives on how welfare can be understood.
Right.
And it gets pretty philosophical.
Okay, I'm ready to get philosophical. Let's dive into those different perspectives. Where do we even begin?
Well, one prominent view, often associated with utilitarianism, focuses on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
Okay.
From this perspective, welfare kind of boils down to subjective experiences.
Okay.
How much happiness or suffering someone is experiencing.
So it's a kind of cost-benefit analysis of happiness.
Yeah.
If an action leads to like a greater balance of pleasure over pain for the individual,
Right.
even if it involves some initial discomfort or restriction, it could be considered justifiable.
That's the basic idea. But as you can imagine, it gets complicated quickly.
Right.
Like, for example, whose happiness matters most?
Yeah. Right.
Should we prioritize the happiness of the individual whose choices are being restricted?
Right.
Or the happiness of those around them
Both.
who might be affected by those choices?
That's a huge question.
It is.
Because if we prioritize the happiness of others over the individual's own subjective experience,
Right.
we risk sliding down a very slippery slope towards social conformity, where any behavior that causes discomfort or disapproval could be seen as grounds for paternalistic intervention.
Exactly. Imagine a society where someone's artistic expression is suppressed because it offends certain sensibilities, or where someone is pressured to conform to traditional gender roles because it makes their family happy.
Right.
A purely subjective view of welfare could be used to justify all sorts of restrictions on individual freedom.
It highlights the need for a definition of welfare that that goes beyond simply pleasing others
Yeah.
or adhering to social norms.
Absolutely.
What are some other perspectives on this?
Well, some philosophers argue that that welfare should encompass objective goods,
Okay.
things that are intrinsically valuable regardless of individual preferences or societal trends.
So even if something doesn't bring immediate happiness or fit with prevailing social norms,
Right.
it could still be considered good for someone if it promotes these objective values.
Yeah,
Can you give us some examples?
certainly. Things like knowledge, health, autonomy itself, even moral virtue have been proposed as objective goods that contribute to a flourishing human life.
Okay.
They might not always lead to warm, fuzzy feelings, but they're seen as essential for human development and well-being in a deeper sense.
That makes me think about education.
Huh?
We mandate that children attend school, even if they'd rather be doing other things, because we believe that education is essential for their future well-being,
Right.
even if they don't see it that way now.
Yeah.
Or think about laws against stealing. Even if someone could get away with stealing and feel no remorse,
Yeah.
we consider it wrong because it violates the objective good of respecting property rights.
Those are excellent examples. They show how a concept of welfare that includes objective goods can be used to justify certain forms of paternalism, even when they might clash with individual preferences in the short term.
Yeah.
But as you can imagine, this approach also raises challenges.
Because who gets to decide what those objective goods are? And how do we balance respecting individual autonomy with promoting those goods,
Right.
especially when they might conflict with someone's current desires or values?
Precisely.
It seems like we're back to that fundamental tension
Yeah.
between beneficence and autonomy.
It is.
And I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
You're exactly right. That tension lies at the very heart of the paternalism debate, and it requires careful consideration of the specific context,
Yeah.
the potential harms and benefits, the level of autonomy at stake,
Yeah.
and the values being prioritized. There's no one-size-fits-all formula.
It's like we've been weaving our way through this intricate tapestry of ideas, and now we've arrived at the edge, realizing that the tapestry extends far beyond what we can see.
Right.
There's always more to explore, more nuances to consider, more perspectives to grapple with.
That's the beauty of philosophical inquiry.
Yeah.
It's about asking the tough questions,
Yeah.
challenging assumptions, and
Right.
embracing the complexity of human experience.
We started by defining paternalism, breaking
Right.
down all its various types.
Right.
Then we dove into the ethical arguments for and against it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've landed on this profound question of what constitutes welfare.
Yeah.
It feels like this deep dive has opened up more doors than it has closed.
And that's a good thing, because it equips us to approach these issues with greater awareness,
Yeah.
sensitivity, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful dialogue.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can carry with them as they navigate this complex world?
I think the most important takeaway is that paternalism is multifaceted. It's not simply about good intentions versus individual freedom. It's about grappling with different conceptions of welfare, weighing potential harms and benefits, and finding a balance between respecting autonomy and promoting well-being.
It's about recognizing that there are no easy answers.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that each situation requires careful consideration and a willingness to engage with different perspectives.
Exactly. And as you encounter paternalistic policies, nudges, or even well-intentioned advice in your own lives, remember the insights we've explored today. Ask yourself, whose welfare is being prioritized?
Yeah.
What definition of good is at play? And is this interference truly justified, even if it's for my own good?
Because by engaging in these critical reflections, by becoming more aware of the subtle ways paternalism operates in our lives, we can become more active and informed participants in shaping a world
Yeah.
where beneficence and autonomy can coexist.
A world where individual freedom and societal well-being are not seen as opposing forces,
Right.
but as interconnected aspects of a flourishing human experience.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into paternalism. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.